this film really emphasizes the more epic way of reading. You claim your place, you become king again. It's a story of power.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast of new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. You probably need a break from all that end of the semester grading. So why not head to the movie theater this weekend? Skip the lines for Gladiator 2 and check out the other classics-inspired film in town, The Return, a dramatization of the second half of the Odyssey, which stars Ralph Fiennes as Odysseus and Juliette Binoche as Penelope. The Return is a treat on several levels. The scenery is gorgeous, the acting, especially of the stars, is exceptional. The cicadas are roaring, and the plot will give you lots to think about, especially in terms of comparison with the text of the Odyssey that we all know and love. This podcast is mostly dedicated to new work in the academic field of ancient Greek studies, but my plan is to use bonus episodes like this one, and also like the one I did a couple of months ago with the creator of Netflix's Chaos, Charlie Covell, to talk about really interesting work going on in what I guess you might just call classical reception. So for this episode, I was very lucky to be able to persuade Barbara Graziosi, Princeton University classicist and Homerist extraordinaire, both to see The Return and to sit down with me and chat about it, all despite her very busy schedule. Our conversation, you should know, is rife with spoilers, but I don't necessarily think that means you should wait until after you've seen the movie to hear Barbara's take on it. Barbara Graziosi is Department Chair and Professor of Classical Studies at Princeton, where she holds the C. Ewing Chair of Ancient Greek. Graziosi attended Oxford University, where she took her B.A. and M.S.T. in Classics at Corpus Christi College, and then Cambridge University, where she earned her Ph.D. in Classics. She then taught at Oxford, Reading, and Durham before joining the faculty at Princeton in 2018. She's also held various visiting positions in Italy. She's written widely on ancient Greek literature, especially Homer, and its reception, as well as more autobiographical pieces on how we make ancient literature our own. Her latest books are Homer, out with OUP in 2018, and very recently, Classics, Love, Revolution, The Legacies of Luigi Settembrini, which she wrote with Andrea Capra and which appeared just this year with OUP. So to get right to it, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Barbara Graziosi. The next voice you'll be hearing is actually mine this time, but she speaks shortly afterwards, I promise. If you maybe could just start by explaining to people the concept of how Homer is a cinematic author, and feel free to talk about the difference between the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yes, there are differences between the Iliad and the Odyssey in this respect, I think quite large ones. So I'll start with the Iliad, because we're going to move on to the Odyssey anyway. There is a sense that the poet's voice can describe exactly what is happening on the battlefield and has total visual control of what is going on. And we even know from where this voice is speaking. And it's a magical position because it's hovering somewhere above the Aegean, looking at the coast and the ships of the Achaeans and the city of Troy behind it. And whenever Homer, or, the poet's voice says on the left, it's from that position. And it's really incredible because thousands of lines later, if someone has died in a particular spot of the battlefield, that's where the corpse still is. And so we need to take that seriously. And then the poet can zoom in and show us what's happening, very close range, and then zoom out again. And this ability to show us the panoramic shot and then go in and show how a spear enters into the body and even what it does inside the body, as if the poet had a medical probe that could show us the detail of the wound, is something that ancient listeners and audiences and later readers found that had some kind of divine power to it, because of course they didn't have the cinema by way of comparison, but what they did have was that divine ability of the gods of seeing the whole battlefield, but then also going right into the action and being able to observe at close quarters without themselves getting into danger. And the poet even remarks on that in the Iliad. He says, then you would not have faltered the way they were fighting if you had been able to take the hand of Athena and go right in there and observe it at close quarters, which is what the poetry is allowing us to do. So there is an objectivity and a visual control of what's going on in the Iliad that struck ancient audiences as super vivid and somehow linked to divine powers. The Odyssey is a little bit different because often we see things not from above, but from the point of view of Odysseus at sort of sea level, where often the camera, as it were, is not fixed for the panoramic shot and then the zooming in, but more we're looking out with Odysseus to where he's going, where the next danger might be. And the scenes from above are few and far between. And in general, there is a question about how reliable poetry is and whether we can really trust what the poet is saying. So the cinematic quality, the seeing that we're given is also at the same time a question about whether we are seeing what was really the case or what we are asked to remember. And as we move on in the Odyssey, that question of memory becomes more and more important. And this is again crucial because ancient epic was, if you like, a technology for memory. That was the point of epic poetry, to remember the deeds of gods and men in the past and to be able to see them, even though they happened long ago, in your mind's eye through this Homeric vividness. But then right at the end of the Odyssey, there is a civil war, and Zeus recommends collective amnesia, and Athena executes, as she often does, this, so that we get an end of the war and not truth and reconciliation or anything like that, but actual forgetfulness, which leaves the Odyssey in a mess because on the one hand, it's an epic. It's supposed to remember the great deeds of gods and men. But on the other hand, it ends with a divine recommendation that all that happened on Ithaca should be forgotten for the sake of living peacefully together on the island.
Well, that's great, Barbara. And it makes me think of so many things. I like this idea almost of Odysseus wearing the body cam. And that's sort of like the level that we're on. And it makes me think ahead to, I mean, this is jumping way, but to the end of the return, that final conversation between Penelope and Odysseus, where Penelope says, we'll remember and we'll forget together.
Exactly. That was one of the many very good touches about that. And even better was immediately after Penelope says that, we see a ship sailing out. And that questions the whole togetherness, because it could be that this is the ship that Telemachus is manning, and we've already heard that he needs to leave, and it may be him. And I think to audiences and viewers who haven't got the Odyssey in mind or the whole legend of Odysseus in mind, will assume this is Telemachus leaving. But of course, there is also the very strong idea that Odysseus himself will leave again after arriving home. And so when she says we'll forget and remember and forget together, and then we see this ship going out, we can also think, well, are they together or are they not together? Has he sailed off again?
Yeah, so it's kind of like, is it the telemachy or is it the telegony that is sort of beginning at the end of the film? Well, so as someone who has thought about these things quite a lot, you I think are in a perfect position to say, what do you think they were going for? What was their conceit with the film? What was their take? I mean, they've gotten rid of the gods in so much as we can see or really actively perceive them. So could you just say a little bit about what you thought the kind of version of things they were going for was?
Yes, so if we think about the Odyssey, if we start with the Odyssey has two versions of Odysseus within one poem, or there are two types of stories intertwined and not without difficulty. So one would be a story of return. So you have an end, which is your home, and it's the one place that matters, and you go there. And once you reach the end, well, this is also a poem about human limitations, about rocky Ithaca, an aging wife, death, ultimately. You are traveling in one direction only, and no return is really possible because we're all traveling from birth to death. But the story of the return is a story that has a lot to teach about human limitations, about the directions of our lives and so on. Then there's a different story, which is not a story of return, but a story of survival. Whatever life throws at you and however finished you are and doomed, if you're Odysseus, somehow you find a way out. And this is exemplified in a million different possible adventures, but perhaps most dramatically in the middle of the poem when he goes to Hades, i.e. to the realm of the dead, and he comes back alive even from there. So the point of that story is not so much that you reach an end, that you learn something about yourself or anything like that. It's more pleasure, enjoyment, and the scrapes that the main character gets into and then manages to get out of, and survival. The mechanism of survival is a mechanism that is about denying death altogether. There is no end to the story. You can always add more adventures. And Odysseus also went there, and he also managed to get out of that. And here he is. And so that is an infinitely expanding story. So then, what is this film doing? Well, first of all, and finally, I have to say, it's taking the second half of the Odyssey seriously, the story of return. We start in Ithaca. We don't start on the island of Calypso. And it's an interesting moment. I was myself wondering, where are we when we see the naked Odysseus on a beach? It could be Phaeacia, which is where we first see him naked on a beach in the Odyssey. But no, we're already in Ithaca. And so the whole film is tilted very much towards what it means to return, not what it means to survive. That said, of course, there's also the question, did I survive? Or am I just a different person by the time I've committed all the war crimes I've committed, by the time I've traveled away for 20 years? Is Penelope going to recognize me as the same person? Has Odysseus survived, or is there no continuity with whom I was? That is also a question that is very much presented to us.
So if we start it with that opening scene, and we get the kind of lie of the land, we get a view of what's been going on in the palace, we get this physical setting, the landscape. What was your reaction to seeing all of that? Did that track? Was it evocative for you, or what did you make of the way that they present the situation in Ithaca?
It worked for me. I thought it was visually stunning, the film. I mean, super beautiful main characters also, but, amazing landscapes. So the opening shots, the sea, we get a sense of the storm, which is also something Virgil picks up. That's also in the opening scenes. We get a very angry sea. And in that sense, maybe we get something of the ominous of the anger of Poseidon somewhere in that image. But as you say, the gods are kept way out of the story, beyond the numinous that we get at the beginning with the sea and a few other possible moments, but very much as undercurrents. The shot in Corfu was, I thought, great. A great location. We have this amazing ancient-looking castle right at the top of the island. We have the olive trees. We have the stone walls. So it was an interesting mixture of the ancient and the timeless that I thought worked quite well. For me, anyway. I mean, this is, I was thinking of, Camus and what he has to say about the very blue and very tragic Mediterranean Sea. And it evoked a certain way of doing the Mediterranean that is both visually stunning, timeless in a way, but also grounded in real landscapes.
Yeah, I remember just the sort of sonic landscape or soundscape of the cicadas are so overpowering, as they really are at so many moments. And I like what you say about the timelessness, because it is sort of hard to place in some ways, because there's a wonderful castle, but it looks kind of Frankish maybe. And then actually, as one of our graduate students, Ronnie, very well pointed out, she's really an expert craftsperson, that Penelope is at a seated loom as opposed to a standing loom. Although I was thinking that Penelope's loom in this, the seated loom makes her anger as she's pushing the threads closer together. I think you could bring that out more at the seated loom. There's sort of the violence when she gets frustrated. But there is that kind of time. It's sort of when it's clearly Mediterranean. It's sort of Greek. There's like when from antiquity to sort of basically any time in pre-modernity. I was wondering then what your take on the path or the order and the procedure of all the recognitions was. I mean, I found myself, and I bet you were too, sort of wondering, is he going to meet Athena or disguised? Is what are they going to do with this? But no.
Yes, I mean, there are, of course, various moments where we think, oh, is this going to happen? I didn't really expect the gods so much, but I did wonder whether Penelope would get to tell her dream. And this is a moment during the fireplace encounter that Odysseus and Penelope have in the Odyssey, where she says something like she recounts a dream and she says, well, I was feeding my geese and I was taking pleasure in these wonderful geese that I was feeding. And then this eagle came and killed them all. And I cried in my sleep. And then the question is, well, what does this mean? And the idea, the beggar more or less answers, don't worry, your husband is coming back. And well, so this is the one and only, I think, moment in the Odyssey in which we get the idea that having a lot of suitors can actually be pleasurable. And I think the question of the suitors, to me, was the most interesting aspect of this take on the Odyssey that we get. They're all very differentiated. Ethnically also, there's one that looks like a Nazi soldier. There's a black suitor, there's an old suitor, a younger suitor. And then the main character among the suitors is Antinos, and I think it's a very interesting character in the film. And more generally, it speaks to what I take to be a key concern of this film, which is an investigation of toxic masculinity at some level. This seems to be, there are all these different male characters, these different models that don't work. And then there's Penelope, who's, I think, also quite a well-drawn and interesting character, very, as in the Odyssey, into the business of denial. So, the most important word she says in the film is no. And it's shouted. And of course, then precisely what she said shouldn't happen happens. Telemachus murders Antinos. We're doing all the spoilers now.
Oh yeah, people have to be reconciled to that.
There's just no way to avoid it. And I think, to me, that was interesting. What does Penelope want in the film? What does she want in the Odyssey? These are questions that are just below the surface. The anger of Penelope that you point out is visible in the film, as is the importance of closing the door. There is a constant play with that door to her bedchamber, and she sealed off one bedchamber already when Odysseus left. That's also a sort of a different version from what we have in the Odyssey. And then there is the question of the bedroom where she currently lives and where she works, and who gets to come in, and how keen she is to shut everybody out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too. And, you're in terms of what's left out, that no that she screams to Telemachus before he lops off the head of Antinous. I felt like that was kind of the closest that we ever got to her dream. Was, that maybe because, and she does have tension with Antinous too in these scenes, like this incredible tension. And it seems like there are almost, the filmmakers were obviously quite canny in terms of knowing what people would notice was not there. So I think the one place you get a gesture to Odysseus's stories is when I think the suitors ask him what his name is and he says no one at some point, or nobody. He just answers this one word, and it's like kind of almost in that there's enough to make the audience that knows think back to all, of 9 through 12.
If I can interrupt on this business of Odysseus the storyteller. So yes, he says, my name is nobody at some point. I can't remember actually if it's to Telemachus, maybe to start. Oh, I can't remember. We need to watch the film
I think
again.
It was in the palace.
Oh, in the palace. All right. So that's one moment. Then at another moment, he says, people love stories. She's a little bit almost dismissive of that. Then there is another moment where Eumaeus says, don't lie to her. She's suffered enough. Now, of course, in the Odyssey, Odysseus lies to Penelope quite a lot. So then, given that instruction, I was interested to see how that conversation would actually go. And he doesn't actually lie as much to her in the movie as he does in the Odyssey. And there's also a lot less flirting going on. There's no going to bed together at the end. There's no really telling story. We'll forget and we'll remember together, Penelope says, hopefully, but then, we see a ship going away, so who knows. So the Odysseus that we see is not so much the trickster, the storyteller. It's more the epic Odysseus. So if we think about stories of adventure, the trickster who always manages to survive, it's one way to read the Odyssey. But this film really emphasizes the more epic way of reading. You claim your place, you become king again, you fight for what is yours. It's a story of power in some very fundamental ways. Also, this film finally says, well, if you as a commander come home alone, having lost every single man in your army, that's kind of not good. It's not going to set you up well for a happy return. So all of these elements are emphasized, and the casting works with that too, because, Ralph Fiennes, I think he looks amazing, and I'm a big fan, and I like watching him, and I never tire of watching him. But it's also true that he's not, he's not very mobile. He doesn't have many different faces. He's a bit English patient, like even in this movie, encased in his own self and not prone to obvious deceit, trickery, flirtation with words, all these aspects that we do see in different versions of Odysseus. So at the back of my mind was also, Juliette Binoche and Ralph Fiennes. Yes, they were together in The English Patient. They're together again. And I saw this slight statuesque aspect rather than the constant mobility and being all things to all people and telling whatever story needs telling in the moment that we see in other possible versions of Odysseus.
Nobody in this is overwhelmingly happy, really, to see Odysseus, right? Except maybe Argos, which was a scene I have to say almost teared up with the recognition with the dog.
Yes, but he doesn't even wag his tail, talking of not being happy. I thought, could they not have at least let this dog wag his tail? No, he just literally sniffs him and dies.
There's all the CGI facial expressions of the dog that they're trying to make as sort of, powerful an actor as Fiennes or Binoche with his facial expressions. But that's the thing is that, there is a lot more emphasis on how Odysseus came back alone and how that's something that he should have to answer for.
Yes.
And there's also, I think, for me, the one thing that this film brought out was just the anger. Everybody, even people Telemachus, even Penelope, they're extremely angry with him.
Yes, as you probably would be, right? There is a sense that the delay is also not against his will. He was with some woman for many years, is how the film presents it. So that's one way to think about Calypso in fully human terms.
Right.
And I think the most serious aspect of this movie for me was that you bring home a flawed character, a flawed man who has done things that he himself cannot justify. And he looks at his woman and he says, will you accept me anyway? Even though what has happened, what I've done, cannot really be excused. And she is an interesting character in terms of what response you can get, because there is very little affirmation in this woman. In fact, as I said, her most important word is no. It's the word that says, do not kill Antinous. And Antinous is the worst of the suitors in the Odyssey. He's the most vicious. He's the one who plots against Telemachus. There are some other suitors. They're very well differentiated in the original poem. There's one who's a seer who also tries to make things good. Then there's Ephialtes. So there are various, depending on which one of the suitors we're looking at, there is more or less reason to spare that particular suitor. And Odysseus even asks Ephialtes, I think, please leave before this massacre starts. And he doesn't, and in the end he ends up killed. But the point in the Odyssey is that Antinous is the worst of them all. And here he's the best of them all. And then the son ends up killing him, and she is very definite that she did not want that, but it comes very late. And the affirmation that Odysseus is looking for, the question that he asks her, am I acceptable to you? That question, I think, is a question of our time.
Mm-hmm.
Very much a question of our time. And it admits no easy answer in the film.
Well, maybe if we think about the interview scene, right? The encounter between Odysseus and Penelope. Penelope has some interesting questions of her own for Odysseus in that scene. And the ones that I noted down were when she's sort of offering this meditation, she says, why do men go to war? And then she looks at him and says, did you rape? That's the first question she asks. Did you rape? And then she says, did you murder women and children? And he says nothing. I thought that was a really kind of extraordinary moment. But what did you make of that interview scene where there's always, the first year supervision question, does she recognize him or not? Or, what's your take on what they made of that?
I thought visually they were clever because they have him hover in the shadows.
Mm-hmm.
He never comes very close to Penelope, so it's a little bit more realistic that she may not recognize him, because after all, yes, there is a fire in the center of the room, but he's always at the periphery of the light that the fire casts. He moves around, and also the camera work is clever because it looks like he's not just hiding from Penelope, he's kind of hiding from himself. This is realistic in terms of veteran post-traumatic stress disorder, that the behavior, the physicality of the scene is one of someone who just kind of wants to withdraw into the walls, doesn't really want to be there, cannot be there, isn't present. That makes a lot of sense to me, just visually and physically. And then the questions that Penelope asks, and also the answer that gets given later, you will never understand, you cannot understand. There is not a lot of hope for a worldview that comes together between them. There isn't much of that. Then there is more female complicity from the nurse who says, oh, she's too weak. And the nurse wants or allows for more violence. Just kill them. more than Penelope. So there's also a generational thing going on there that I think is worth considering between the old nurse and the younger Penelope and their relationship to Odysseus that has different degrees of acceptance and affirmation of who he is and what he's done.
Yeah, Penelope plays it quite enigmatically, because I was sort of going into the interview scene between the two of them, expecting them to make it clear that she recognized him, and was, pleased that they left that degree of ambiguity there. But then there's that moment in the contest of the bow when Odysseus, as disguised as a beggar, asks for the bow, and Telemachus at first is hesitating, and Penelope kind of hisses at him, "Give your father the bow," which is sort of this very, I thought, striking moment where it's like, okay, she clearly by now gets it. But you mentioned this sort of they really played up the kind of PTSD element, with his 1,000-yard stare and all that Troy is so much on his mind. And I noted down this line where somebody asks him, I think when they're in the hut of Eumaeus, asking about the Trojan War. I can't remember, maybe it was in that scene, but at some point Odysseus says, "The war is everything, everywhere, all I see and touch, waiting for me to make it happen again." And I think that the film sets up this up, which is something obviously, readers and audiences have noticed, is that there's a kind of, another war at the end of this, that savagery and the slaughter of the suitors, that is the war happening again, and throwing light on the savagery that, often gets kind of glossed over in some ways with the Troy and the horse story and all that kind of business. So I was wondering, what did you make of that really deep psychologizing sort of aspect of Odysseus? Because he is not garrulous. He's not chatty. He's laconic in this. He's keeping so much to himself. He's keeping so much bound up so tight inside. And it's clear that, what the ruminations are, and he's carrying all this stress. I mean, what did you make of that? Did you find that effective?
So you can read it psychologically like that, and I think that's what the film invites us to do. But you can also ask that question in more general ways, and I think Homeric epic has demanded that generalizing of the question to, the possibility of pacifism, really, or of a world dominated by different values that Penelope is trying to articulate, always in her own negative, not this, not that way. Do we need this? Do we need that? Rather than this is, what we might put on the table. But for me, when he says, the war is everywhere, yes, it's an anticipation that there's going to be another war is about to happen because he has returned. There's going to be civil war in Ithaca. And, as many Homeric scholars have pointed out, and scholars of Homeric society, there is no answer. If you kill all the youth of an island, even killing Odysseus himself says it in the Odyssey. After killing just one suitor, we should be going into exile. So, now we've killed all the youth and their family and their associates. And there is no solution in the Odyssey except collective amnesia in a way. Otherwise, these people would need avenging and there would be no end to it. So, but that's the point. Can there be an end to war? That's the question. And again, I think this is a question that is on our mind right now. I mean, of course, there are those who say we already are having the Third World War because there are so many connected wars going on right now. And the question, can there be an end to this, is not just a question of the psychology of Odysseus. It's also a question about war and masculinity also.
In the scene of the slaughter of the suitors, one thing that people have been pointing out in the reviews is that they omit the slaughter of the disloyal maids or enslaved women. What did you make of that? Were you expecting it, or what did you make of it? Because we do see them in flagrante being disloyal.
Yes, so these are interesting moments in which Penelope walks through the palace and right, left and center, wherever she sort of in her trail, there are people having sex, even though the suitors are kind of outside the palace also. So it's not completely clear how that sets up, but visually it makes a lot of sense that this woman who is walking through and wants to go to her own bedroom and lock the door, as Antinos then points out, well, some people actually want company, but there is that setup that makes us think, well, what is going to happen to this woman? And of course, in the aftermath of all the attention that the scene in which they're all hanged by Telemachus, like so many birds, and their feet twitch a little. And, now that scene has become very famous also because of Emily Wilson's translation and how much she's made of that. And she's made of the way she translates it differently from male translators who've added a few words of disparagement like the sluts and so on to justify the scene, words that are not in the original, as she points out. So I think even general readers of the Odyssey, or even people who've just shown an interest for that translation, and there are many, might have expected that to happen, and it doesn't happen. And so I think there's a good question why we are not shown that. I think one answer might be that it would make the film about something else, namely something akin to domestic violence. You get very traumatized and stressed during the war. You come home and then you just take it out on your wife, or on other women who cannot defend themselves, are weaker, and can then become just victims of your various frustrations with the world. Okay, this would be a sort of another theme that is very important, especially in Italy. And of course, the director is Italian. There's a huge concern at the moment with feminicide, all these deaths by domestic violence that are going on all the time. So I think if they'd shown the maids being killed that way, it would have been more about that. Whereas this film seemed to me to be more interested in the possibility of redemption through female acceptance of the man.
Yeah, I mean, it would have raised, those questions that the text itself raises, which is, about their agency, and those seem important questions, but other than what the film was trying to push.
Yes. And the other thing that they don't do at all is that we don't have Phemius. We don't have the singer. We don't have any very explicit reflection on the pleasures of fiction. That is very played down, in the interests of striking a note of seriousness that comes out, I think, of the film, which is also, with those two actors and the very many close-ups of their faces, it's about a more introspective approach.
Yeah, I think introspective is the right word. I mean, the only time is that, that moment when you mentioned that Odysseus kind of disparagingly says, people love their stories. And he's kind of doing this corrective in the hut of Eumaeus about what happened with the horse and blah, 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 blah. But it is quite a, there's not a huge amount of dialogue in the movie for for its subject matter. Well, I guess the last big question I have to ask you just in terms of plot choices is Laertes. And this film being of the school of thought that we can get rid of 24, basically, that's not important. And we can also kill off Laertes before the big action happens. What did you make of the way that Laertes was presented? I was sort of, I guess it fits into all these kind of questions about memory, is that he's completely lost his memory. Might be a charitable way of reading that character. But I was really struck that they made him kind of like doddering and...
Yes, he's a bit demented, isn't he? And just too old. And I suppose how I was a bit shocked that he dies straight away at the beginning. And it helps with the pathos because, of course, the fact that you're there, that you could have said hello to your father, but he dies while you're in the hut of Eumaeus. So that helps with the, oh, poor Odysseus. Like it tilts our sympathies towards Odysseus, which is something the Odyssey also does through different means, but is an important aspect of how we are getting manipulated into, feeling some sympathy. So it worked in terms of sympathy, but then it's also interesting because you rightly point out, well, even if he had gone and said, hello, Dad, he sort of has dementia, so he's not going to recognize his son. He wouldn't recognize him even if he'd been there all along, let alone now. So it is too late. And the Odyssey plays with that idea that Odysseus arrives at the last possible moment before he becomes an irrelevance in his own home anyway. And that's done in the Odyssey, I think, especially through the bow, because Telemachus, we are told, would have strung the bow. And it's Odysseus who says to his son, don't you dare. Don't you do that. But had he done that, we're also told at that point, it was agreed that he could rule and Penelope wouldn't have to marry anyone. So Telemachus would have come of age. So Odysseus, by arriving, also prevents that. And because a human life is limited, he arrives at the last possible moment before he himself becomes an old and redundant, a redundant old man himself. So I think it's done differently, but the effect is similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that in a way, for me, the film, brought out a couple of things, I guess, that I hadn't entirely clocked before. The one being that, exactly as you're saying, that this isn't just a random moment. 10 years isn't just sort of a random moment in time, but it's when things are really, really coming to a head. Of course, we all know that Telemachus is about to come of age, blah, blah, blah. But it's that the circumstances have really come together such that this is the moment. And I guess then also, like I was saying, just, the anger that people feel at Odysseus, the issue of him returning alone. And I think also the film brought out for me, I hadn't really internalized affectively, I guess, the fear of Telemachus being killed. But, they have all these pursuit scenes and the kind of real atmosphere of fear that there is from, because of the suitors, how scary they really are.
Yeah.
Because they seem kind of, they always seem sort of buffoonish to me in a way. But in this, like, they are scary.
Yeah.
So I guess I just close by asking, did you find, I don't want to ask, quite whether you liked the film, but did you find it interesting, and would you ever consider teaching with it?
I might, yes, teaching with it. I mean, depending how much time I have to look at different versions. But I think I did find it interesting. I liked it. Of course, it's difficult if you know the Odyssey very well. You will have moments in which you think, oh, what about, maybe I would have done that differently. But I will say that it's also clear that the Odyssey was read very carefully. So there is this one moment, there is this famous, to me anyway, very effective simile in which Odysseus strings a bow and then the string rings the same way as when a singer plucks the string of his instrument. And this is a superimposition of Odysseus on the bard who is telling the story, on the performer rhapsode maybe that is evoking a performance to the lyre. I mean, a lot is going on with that simile in terms of aligning Odysseus with the storytelling and with this. And there in the film, we hear the sound of the string, and it's clear that resonance with the original text is there. So yes, I think students could get quite a bit out of thinking about this, and it would be a way of thinking beyond the adventures and the tales and the fantasy and all that towards the more epic, the more hard-nosed, the more delayed gratification, claim your place in the world aspect of the poem that is also there, but that people don't usually read with pleasure because there isn't that much pleasure to be had really from that part of the Odyssey. So yes, I think this is a film I would recommend and would think about presenting to students.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me, the way that I found myself falling at the end of it was that it's almost like this film is you've read the Odyssey, but here's what really happened. And then this poem got embellished and embroidered all around it. But this is like how it really went down in real life on planet Earth.
It could be that historical. And that, of course, is something that was already inspired by the Odyssey, tells us all the time, right? That this story that we're hearing may not be how it actually went down, because Phemius, before he gets killed by Odysseus, or when he's about to be killed by Odysseus, says, don't kill me, I will sing essentially the Odyssey and you will feature as a great hero and nothing to fear. I will do exactly the kind of poem that you want. And then we get that poem in a way. We hear that kind of story. So yes, but if you're going to threaten someone the way Odysseus threatens Phemius, you're going to get the story you want, but is it also going to be a true story? Mm-hmm. So there is also in the Odyssey a real interrogation about power and what it takes to rule.
Well, this has been great, Barbara. I was wondering, I hope we can close down here with my word association game, as I know that you have to run, and I'm just going to throw out a couple of words and ask you to think of the first thing that comes to mind. Okay?
Okay.
So the first is the return.
Yes, the question of place is for me place and where we are at home.
The Odyssey.
A person, Odysseus, and a whole way of being in the world as a result.
About the suitors.
A plurality of men who are for once defined by their relationship to a woman.
Penelope.
An enigma. And in this film, someone who wants to be left alone, I think.
Finally, Homer.
Good question. That combination of vision and blindness is for me an important way to think about this figure.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for this conversation. Thank you for your time. And it's been great talking about this very interesting movie with you.
Thank you, Joanna. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.